It was a cold October afternoon in the quiet town of Briarwood, Tennessee, when tragedy struck. Briarwood was the kind of place where neighbors exchanged pleasantries and attended Sunday service together. At the heart of the community was Margaret Whitley, a 34-year-old schoolteacher who, by all accounts, was the perfect example of righteousness and moral purity. Raised in an extremely religious household, Margaret was the daughter of a strict Baptist pastor, and her life had been one of devotion, obedience, and unwavering faith. At Briarwood Middle School, Margaret was known for her discipline and commitment to her students. To the outside world, she was patient, caring, and involved, often staying after school to help students struggling with their studies. Her favorite student was 13-year-old Kyle Peterson, a bright but introverted boy with a quiet charm. Kyle came from a broken home his father had left years ago, and his mother worked long hours at the local diner. Margaret took a particular interest in him, seeing herself as a guiding light in his life. However, beneath Margaret's polished exterior, a far more sinister nature lurked. The pressure to maintain the appearance of religious virtue had long warped her perception of control and morality. She saw Kyle as not just a student, but as something much more, a vessel she needed to mold and dominate. Over the months, her obsession with him grew. She convinced herself it was God's will for her to save him, to bring him closer to the path of righteousness by any means necessary. One late afternoon, just days before Halloween, Kyle disappeared. He had stayed late after school for what was supposed to be a tutoring session with Margaret. His mother, tired from her shift at the diner, assumed Kyle had gone to a friend's house, but as the evening dragged on, her worry grew. When he didn't return home by 9 p.m., she called the police. Margaret, in her calm and composed manner, played the concerned teacher when officers arrived at the school to ask questions. She told them Kyle had left around 5:30 p.m. and suggested he might have been headed home or perhaps to the library, which was only a block away. The police organized a search, but it would be days before any trace of Kyle was found. What no one knew was that Kyle never left the school that night. Margaret, fueled by her delusion that she was acting under divine guidance, had locked him in her classroom. She had chosen that day with care, knowing that the janitors would be on the opposite side of the building cleaning. Her plan had been building for months, and now it was in motion. The innocent boy sat quietly in the dimly lit classroom, growing nervous as the minutes ticked by. Margaret watched him closely, her mind racing with twisted thoughts about salvation and discipline. She spoke in soft tones, promising him that what was about to happen was for his own good, that it was a necessary sacrifice to save him from a life of sin. Kyle's heart raced as Margaret began speaking in a slow, deliberate manner, her words laced with an unnerving calmness. He didn't fully understand what she meant by sacrifice, but the ominous shift in her tone filled him with dread. He glanced toward the door, considering an escape, but Margaret quickly moved to block his path, her once gentle demeanor replaced by something much darker. "You have to trust me, Kyle," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "God has a plan for you, and I'm here to guide you. No one else will understand, but that's why it's between us." Kyle's eyes widened and fear gripped him. This was no longer his caring teacher, this was a stranger, someone consumed by her own distorted beliefs. He felt trapped, but he tried to reason with her, pleading to be let go, promising he wouldn't tell anyone. But Margaret was beyond reasoning. In her mind, she wasn't just a teacher anymore, she had become a vessel for what she believed to be divine will. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small vial of chloroform she had purchased months earlier, knowing the day would come when she'd need it. As Kyle struggled, she pressed the cloth against his face, murmuring prayers under her breath. The boy's cries were muffled as he inhaled the fumes, his body going limp in her arms. Margaret stood over him, her hands trembling with the weight of what she had just done. For a brief moment, reality seemed to crash down on her had she gone too far. But she shook off the guilt. No, this was God's plan. She had been chosen for this. With Kyle unconscious, Margaret moved quickly. She knew she had to act before anyone became suspicious. As night descended over Briarwood, she carried the boy's limp body to the trunk of her car, parked discreetly behind the school. The roads were quiet, as they always were in this small town, and she drove through the back streets until she reached the outskirts, where dense woods surrounded the area. The forest had always been a sacred place for Margaret. As a child, her father had taken her there to teach her about the beauty of God's creation. the solitude it provided for prayer and reflection. Now, it would serve a different purpose. She drove deep into the woods, the gravel crunching under the tires as she found a secluded spot she had scouted days earlier. There, in the heart of the forest, far from prying eyes, she pulled Kyle from the car. He was still unconscious, his chest rising and falling softly. She knelt beside him, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead as tears welled in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, though her voice was still laced with conviction. "This is the only way." Margaret had already prepared everything. A shallow grave had been dug in advance, hidden beneath the leaves and branches that covered the forest floor. She believed that by ending Kyle's life, she was saving him from a world of sin, from the inevitable damnation she feared for him. This twisted interpretation of her faith had completely taken over her mind, making her blind to the horror of her actions. As the boy began to stir, Margaret acted quickly. She grabbed the shovel she had stashed nearby and brought it down with sickening force. The boy's body convulsed for a moment before falling still. Silence filled the woods, save for Margaret's heavy breathing and the sound of rustling leaves in the wind. Her hands shaking, she began to cover Kyle's body with dirt, muttering prayers as she worked. By the time Margaret finished covering Kyle's lifeless body, the night had deepened. The forest around her was eerily silent, but inside her mind, the noise was deafening. For a few moments, she stood over the shallow grave, staring at the freshly turned earth, as if waiting for some sign from above to reassure her that she had done the right thing. But no sign came. As the adrenaline began to fade, a wave of crushing reality washed over her. She looked down at her trembling, dirt-covered hands and realized the weight of what she had done. Margaret had always believed she was carrying out God's will, that her actions were righteous and necessary. But now, standing alone in the darkness, she felt no divine approval, only a deep, gnawing sense of guilt. Panic set in. The voices that had once urged her to act in the name of God now fell silent, replaced by the haunting thought that she had made a terrible mistake. Margaret's mind raced what would happen next. She had no plan beyond this moment. For the first time, the facade of righteousness crumbled, and fear took hold. Quickly, she gathered the few remaining items she had brought and hurried back to her car. The drive back to Briarwood was a blur, the dark, winding roads closing in on her like a nightmare. Every turn, every shadow seemed to hold the threat of discovery. She could almost hear the sirens in the distance, even though they weren't there. Yet. Back at home, Margaret scrubbed her hands raw in the sink, but no matter how much she washed, she couldn't rid herself of the feeling that Kyle's blood was still on them. She collapsed into a chair, staring blankly at the wall. What had started as a twisted mission of salvation had now turned into an unforgivable crime. Deep down, she knew there was no going back. The next morning, Briarwood was in chaos. News of Kyle Peterson's disappearance had spread quickly, and by dawn, search parties had formed. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers joined the effort to find the boy. His mother, Susan, stood at the center of it all, her face pale and lined with sleepless worry. She had gone from house to house the night before, knocking on doors, pleading for any information about her son. Margaret, who had spent the night sleepless in her own home, knew she had to maintain her composure. She had been the last person to see Kyle, and any sign of nervousness would draw suspicion. She prepared herself mentally, crafting a story to explain the previous evening. She would play the concerned teacher, the one who had been Kyle's last point of contact, but who tragically had no answers to offer. That morning, as the police began to question the faculty and staff at Briarwood Middle School, Margaret was approached by Officer Daniels, the lead investigator. He was a seasoned detective, and though his demeanor was calm and polite, his sharp eyes never missed a detail. "Ms. Whitley, I understand you were tutoring Kyle yesterday after school. Can you walk me through what happened?" Daniels asked, pen poised over his notepad. Margaret swallowed hard, forcing a tight smile. "Yes, of course. He stayed for about an hour to finish some math homework. He seemed fine quiet, but that's normal for him. I let him go around 5:30. I assumed he was heading home. He didn't mention any plans or anything out of the ordinary." Daniels nodded but didn't break eye contact. "Did you notice anything unusual at all? Any signs that he might have been upset or planning to go somewhere else?" Margaret shook her head, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "No, nothing. I was just trying to help him with his grades. I never imagined something like this could happen." Daniels scribbled a few notes, but the conversation left a subtle tension in the air. Margaret knew she couldn't afford any mistakes now. As the search intensified, her carefully constructed story would need to hold up under scrutiny. But with every passing hour, the weight of her actions pressed harder on her, and the fear of being discovered gnawed at her conscience. The days ahead would bring more questions, more suspicions, and Margaret wasn't sure how much longer she could maintain the facade. The walls were closing in, and the truth, no matter how well hidden, had a way of surfacing. As days passed, the town's concern for Kyle's disappearance grew into a fevered desperation. Search parties combed through the nearby woods and fields, volunteers covering every inch of Briarwood's outskirts. Helicopters whirred overhead, and missing posters with Kyle's smiling face were plastered across storefronts and telephone poles. The entire town seemed gripped by the mystery. Margaret maintained her carefully crafted persona, attending prayer vigils, speaking softly with other teachers, and offering comfort to Kyle's heartbroken mother, Susan. She even led the school in a special prayer for his safe return, her voice steady despite the knots twisting in her stomach. To everyone around her, Margaret was the epitome of a kind, compassionate educator shaken by the tragedy. But inside, Margaret was unraveling. Every time someone mentioned Kyle's name, her heart skipped a beat, and each new search update felt like a noose tightening around her neck. Officer Daniels had visited the school 3 more times, and each time his questions grew more probing. He hadn't accused her of anything outright, but Margaret sensed his growing suspicion. Daniels was an experienced investigator, and something about her story wasn't sitting right with him. On a chilly Wednesday morning, Daniels returned once again, this time accompanied by a younger officer, Detective Collins. Margaret noticed the shift in his tone immediately. Daniels wasn't here just to chat anymore, he was here to dig deeper. Ms. Whitley, we've spoken to a number of Kyle's classmates and teachers, Daniels began as he sat down across from her in the empty classroom. A few of them mentioned that Kyle spent quite a bit of extra time with you, after school. More than most students. Margaret smiled tightly, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Yes, I've been helping him with his grades. He struggled with math, and given his home situation, I wanted to offer as much support as I could. Collins raised an eyebrow. Some of the other students said Kyle seemed uncomfortable about staying late. Like he didn't really want to be here. Did he ever mention anything to you about not wanting to come? Margaret's breath caught in her throat for a moment, but she recovered quickly. No, he never said anything like that to me. He was a shy boy, though. Sometimes students don't always express what they're feeling. Daniels leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. You're absolutely sure Kyle left around 5:30 that night? We've checked the security cameras at the main entrance, and we don't see him leaving the building. Margaret's pulse quickened. She hadn't accounted for the cameras. She swallowed hard, careful to keep her expression neutral. He must have gone out the back door by the playground. It's not unusual for students to take that route. Daniels nodded slowly, but his silence felt heavy. We'll be reviewing all the camera footage again, he said quietly. I'm sure you understand, we have to be thorough. Margaret forced another smile, but inside, her panic was rising. She knew the walls were closing in faster than she had anticipated. The cameras, the mounting questions, it was all spiraling out of control. She had miscalculated, and now it was only a matter of time before they found the holes in her story. As the detectives left, Margaret sat in the empty classroom, her mind racing. For the first time, the thought crossed her mind that she might not escape this. She had always believed in divine protection, that her actions were justified in the eyes of God. But now she felt abandoned, her faith shaken to its core. No amount of prayer could undo what she had done. Meanwhile, Susan Peterson, Kyle's mother, was growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress in the investigation. The police had been diligent, and the town had rallied around her, but the days without her son were unbearable. Something felt wrong, more wrong than just the tragic disappearance of her child. There was a nagging thought at the back of her mind, a whisper she couldn't ignore. She had been too tired to notice at first. But as the days went on, Susan began to reflect on some of Kyle's behavior before he disappeared. He had become withdrawn, quieter than usual, and hesitant to talk about school. She chalked it up to typical teenage mood swings, but now, in hindsight, something about it gnawed at her. One night, Susan went through Kyle's belongings, desperate for any clue that could point to what had happened. His room was as he had left it, school books scattered on his desk, drawings tacked to the walls, and his favorite comic books stacked neatly beside his bed. She sat on his bed, clutching one of his t-shirts to her chest, when something caught her eye. In his backpack, tucked between the pages of his math notebook, was a crumpled piece of paper. Susan smoothed it out, her heart sinking as she read the few scribbled words, "I don't like staying after with MS. Whitley. She's weird." Susan's hands shook as she read the note over and over again. Her mind raced. How had she missed this? Had Kyle been trying to tell her something? All the times he stayed late for tutoring suddenly took on a different meaning. And then it clicked. Margaret Whitley, the beloved teacher who had been so helpful and kind, was she hiding something? Susan didn't want to believe it, but the sinking feeling in her stomach told her she couldn't ignore this. She rushed to her phone and called Officer Daniels, her voice shaky with desperation. "I found something," she said, clutching the note in her hand. "It's about MS Whitley. You need to look into her." Officer Daniels' demeanor shifted immediately upon receiving Susan's call. He had been circling around Margaret Whitley for days, but he lacked the concrete evidence needed to take action. Susan's discovery, though small, was the first real crack in Margaret's carefully constructed story. Daniels and Detective Collins quickly moved to obtain a search warrant for Margaret's home and classroom, knowing they had to act before she could cover her tracks any further. Meanwhile, Margaret was falling apart. She sensed the investigation was tightening around her. Each day it became harder to maintain her composure, to greet her colleagues and students with the same reassuring smile. Her hands shook during class, and her voice wavered in prayer. The guilt and paranoia had become suffocating. She avoided Officer Daniels at all costs, knowing his quiet intensity was aimed squarely at her. As night fell, Margaret sat in her dimly lit living room, Bible in hand, trying to calm her frantic mind. She had always believed she was acting out of divine will, that her intentions were pure, but now she questioned everything. The silence of the night only amplified her guilt, and the weight of Kyle's death hung over her like a curse. A knock on the door startled her. Heart pounding, she opened it to find Officer Daniels and Detective Collins standing on her porch, their faces grim. "MS Whitley," Daniels said calmly, "we have a warrant to search your home. We need you to cooperate with us." Margaret's stomach dropped, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Of course, officer. I have nothing to hide," she lied, stepping aside to let them in. Her mind raced. Did they know? Had they found the grave? Panic clawed at her, but she remained outwardly composed as the officers began their search. It didn't take long for them to uncover unsettling evidence. In Margaret's bedroom, they found an envelope containing personal items that belonged to Kyle's, small mementos she had taken from him over time. A drawing he had done in class, a photo of him from a school event, even a stray pencil he had left behind. To anyone else, they were harmless objects, but to Daniels, they were proof of her obsession. MS Whitley, Daniels began as he stood in the doorway of the bedroom, holding up the envelope. "Why do you have these?" Margaret's face paled. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The truth was clawing its way to the surface, and she knew there was no escaping it. Her perfect facade was crumbling, and with it, the last remnants of control she had desperately clung to. I was just trying to help him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Daniels exchanged a look with Collins, his suspicion confirmed. "Where's Kyle, MS Whitley?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "It's time to tell us the truth." Margaret's breath hitched, and tears welled in her eyes. She had spent so long convincing herself that she was saving Kyle, that her actions were righteous, but now she couldn't even convince herself of that anymore. Her twisted sense of morality had shattered, and all that remained was the weight of her crime. "He's in the woods," she finally admitted, her voice breaking. "I buried him in the woods." The confession sent a chill through the room, and Daniels felt a mix of relief and disgust. Margaret collapsed into a chair, her hands trembling as the tears finally came. "I thought I was doing God's work. I thought I was saving him." Daniels nodded grimly. "We'll find him." The officers left immediately, a search team already on standby, heading for the dense woods outside Briarwood. Margaret, broken and resigned to her fate, sat alone in her house, knowing her life as she knew it was over. She had lived in the shadow of her religious devotion for so long that she had lost sight of right and wrong, her delusions driving her to commit the ultimate sin. The search for Kyle's body led officers deep into the woods, guided by Margaret's vague confession. The night was cold, the moon casting eerie shadows through the trees as the search team fanned out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. After hours of searching, they found it a shallow grave, hidden beneath a bed of leaves and dirt, just as Margaret had described. The sight of the small body lying in the earth was enough to make even the seasoned officers pause. Kyle had been a bright, innocent boy, and the senseless tragedy of his death weighed heavily on everyone present. The team worked quickly but carefully to recover Kyle's remains. When the news reached Briarwood the following morning, the town was plunged into collective mourning. Susan Peterson was inconsolable, the heartbreak of losing her son compounded by the knowledge of who had taken him from her. Margaret Whitley was arrested at her home without incident. The once revered teacher now faced the cold reality of her actions. The town that had once admired her now viewed her as a monster, her religious zealotry exposed as the driving force behind her heinous crime. In court, Margaret offered no real defense. She sat silently as the prosecution detailed her twisted obsession with Kyle and the delusions that had led her to kidnap and murder him. Her family, devout and proud, refused to attend the trial, unable to reconcile their daughter's actions with the faith they held so dear. Margaret was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She showed no emotion as the sentence was read, her expression vacant, as though the weight of her crime had hollowed her out entirely. As Margaret was led away in handcuffs, the town of Briarwood struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The tragedy of Kyle's death, coupled with the betrayal of a beloved teacher, left scars that would linger for years. The community, once so tightly knit, was now fractured by grief and disbelief. For Susan, there was no solace, no closure. She visited Kyle's grave often, bringing flowers and sitting quietly beside him, her heart forever broken. The town moved on in time, but the memory of Kyle Peterson, the boy who had been taken too soon, would never fade. And for Margaret, the life she had once known, the life of faith, righteousness, and control, was gone forever, replaced by a lifetime of silence and reflection in a prison cell, where the echoes of her actions would haunt her for the rest of her days. Margaret Whitley's life in prison was a far cry from the control she once wielded in Briarwood. In her small, gray cell, she found no solace, no redemption. The other inmates had learned about her crime, a teacher who murdered an innocent boy, and in the brutal world behind bars, there was no pity for child killers. She kept to herself, praying daily, but her prayers were no longer for forgiveness, they were pleas for survival. The guards kept a distant eye on her, aware of the animosity she stirred among the prison population. Whispers followed Margaret wherever she went, snide remarks and threatening glares from women who saw her as the lowest of the low. But she endured it all in silence, clinging to the belief that this was part of her punishment, a test of her faith, even though deep down she felt abandoned by the God she had once believed guided her every step. Months passed, and Margaret's health began to decline. The weight of her crime and the constant fear took a toll on her mind and body. The nightmares of Kyle's face haunted her every night, and she woke up drenched in sweat, terrified of her own thoughts. She grew thinner, her hair graying prematurely, and her once sharp mind dulled by the crushing isolation. Yet even as she slipped further into despair, a lingering hope remained that she could outlast the hatred, that her suffering would eventually lead to forgiveness, either in this life or the next. But in the violent world of prison, not everyone believed in second chances. On a particularly cold morning in November, Margaret's routine began like any other day. She attended a mandatory chapel service, sitting alone in the back, barely listening to the sermon. As the service ended and the inmates shuffled back to their cells, Margaret kept her head down, avoiding eye contact as she had learned to do. But today something was different. The tension in the air was palpable. As she made her way down the dimly lit corridor, she heard the subtle shift of footsteps behind her. Her pulse quickened, and before she could react, she was shoved hard into a dark corner of the hallway, far from the view of any guards. The sudden force knocked her breath out, and when she tried to scream, a rough hand clamped over her mouth. 3 inmates surrounded her, faces twisted with rage. They had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the perfect opportunity to deliver their own brand of justice. Margaret's heart raced as fear gripped her entire body. She had always feared this moment, but no amount of prayer could prepare her for the brutal reality. "You think you can hide behind your prayers?" one of the women spat, her voice dripping with venom. "What you did to that boy, there's no forgiveness for that." Margaret's eyes widened in terror. She tried to plead, but no words came out. Her throat tightened as they cornered her, blocking any hope of escape. The first blow came swift and hard, a punch to her ribs that left her gasping for air. The women attacked with a savage fury, kicking and beating her as she crumpled to the ground. Each hit landed with a sickening thud, and Margaret could do nothing but curl into herself, her body convulsing with pain. The sound of her own bones cracking echoed in her ears. The assault lasted only minutes, but to Margaret, it felt like an eternity. By the time the guards reached her, the attackers had vanished into the shadows, leaving her broken and bleeding on the cold concrete floor. She lay motionless, barely clinging to life, as the taste of blood filled her mouth. In her final moments, as the edges of her vision blurred and her body went numb, Margaret's mind wandered back to that night in the woods. She saw Kyle's face, his bright, innocent eyes staring back at her. But this time there was no comfort, no divine message. Only silence and the crushing realization that her life had spiraled into a hell she couldn't escape. Margaret Whitley died hours later in the prison infirmary, her body too shattered to be saved. The news of her death reached Briarwood quickly, but few in the town mourned. Some saw it as a fitting end for a woman who had betrayed their trust and taken a young life so senselessly. For Susan Peterson, the death of her son's killer offered no closure, only a hollow sense of justice. Kyle was still gone, and no amount of punishment, whether from the courts or the prison walls, could bring him back. But for the rest of the town, Margaret's violent end felt like a closing chapter to a story that had darkened their community for far too long. In the end, Margaret Whitley's life was one defined not by faith or virtue, but by obsession, delusion, and an irreversible act of evil. And though she died in prison, her legacy as the teacher who crossed the ultimate line would haunt Briarwood for generations.